What's going on, everybody? It's Frito here for Clickheads, and today we're discussing the most nerfed agent in Valorant ever and Riot's impossible job to balance for both ranked and top-level team play at the same time. In the most recent patch 1.07, Sage got nuked across the board, removing a lot of the flexibility in her kit. Now her wall no longer is as effective in reactive use against big pushes, but also as well worse to create a safe res. Her heal was toned down, but made specifically worse when used on herself as to not impede on the durability of duelists, and her slow is about a third smaller in size. In a recent interview with Hitscan, senior game designer Max Grossman discussed Riot's thought process on the heavy nerfs. In the interview, they reveal some interesting stats about Sage's power in ranked, stating that she had an over 90% pick rate, and surprisingly enough, had a higher win rate on the attacking side, which, as you might imagine, threw a wrench in the plans of the Valorant devs, as in the past, they have described Sage as the premier stalling agent. But as it turns out, her utility, specifically I'd say the wall to take space or deny entry on post plant, may have been statistically her biggest strength. All of this after multiple nerfs in the past, mind you. And when you combine with how safe of an agent she was to play most of the time, with so much guaranteed value, that Riot decided the previous nerfs weren't enough, her win rate was still too high, so they concluded it was finally time to, quote, rip the band-aid off, unquote, and get her to a spot where she performed closer to the rest of the agents of the game. This is where I get into major problems here, because one, I think no matter what, Valorant is going to have meta-defining agents in solo queue, and really there's no way for balance alone to solve that. I don't know the stats of the newly buffed Breach in ranked, but I for sure can guess that he's going to be a major dominant pick in competitive play with organized teams. And this is the crux of Riot's problem, because in the highest tiers, Sage already had begun to be phased out while she was racking up these really high stats in ranked. This begins to highlight the balancing problem Riot's going to have moving forward with Valorant, is that the pro scene, just based on being a pre-made, practicing, and stretching the capacity of the game, they're always going to be able to achieve an entirely different kind of play to ranked. So no matter how the game is balanced, agents will perform disproportionately in both sectors. So how did this happen? How did Sage perform so strongly in one context, but start to lose favor in the other? Well, previously, for pro play, in the clog meta in beta, defenses were so high that the game arguably played slower than CSGO. So if you weren't mirroring the Sage, you often just weren't interacting with the slow-paced metagame. But between balance changes, but perhaps even more importantly, players improving at the game and maximizing movement and aggressive kit, over time, merely delaying a push wasn't really good enough to keep Sage being a must-pick in organized play. Balance played a big role in this, but I also think the community's quick improvement of the game, particularly on very high skill ceiling picks like Sova and Jett, might be more responsible in this turn towards more aggressive play. We don't have a catchy name for the most recent meta that culminated in the end of the Ignition series, but it's not close to a clog meta, that's for sure. Instead of being defined by slow tactical play, by the end of the Ignition series, the game was empowering more of a hero shooter gameplay style that looked surprisingly close to Overwatch, and go figure, the Overwatch League MVP is considered by many to be the single best Valorant player in the world, bringing over the rigorous work ethic from typical OWL players and schooling many of the CS crossover players with possibly the deepest agent pool and a very unique creative approach that stretched the imagination of how the game could be played. I mean, SINATRA possibly deserves an entire video of his own describing his influence over the entire NA meta, but for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to refer to this era of Valorant as the SINATRA meta. In beta, the clog meta was slow, cagey, and defensive abilities defined the game. In the SINATRA meta, however, there's much more movement, aggression, whether it comes from Jett's playmaking carry, the operator, or the big ability exchanges that lead directly to kills. Omen's paranoia and Sova's recon dart being some of the strongest kit. Quite a big turn from the launch of the game, where you would have said Sage and Cypher defined the game. And although Sage was still playable in that context, she was beginning to lose favor as she hardly interacted with the op or Jett, who typically is paired with it, and although you might think slow orb would be good in exchanges of a utility, it by design delays engagements more so than sets you up for kills, and with the popularity of agents like Omen, Jet, and Raze who can escape out of its effect, it's not the same guaranteed value in team play as it tends to be in ranked. You see, the difference really is the crux of this all. In ranked, rush B no stop is a typical go-to strat, and when players aren't as coordinated or as experienced with their abilities on the entry as pros are, Sage's utility can shut down entire pushes. But this is why balancing for the public is tricky, because in theory, if the community were given enough time to adjust and learn the tactics the pros have already developed to plan and outplay for Sage's slowing effects, perhaps her performance would begin to emulate the more balanced results she sees in organized play, but admittedly that might take a long time if it ever would happen. But beyond the performance stats, there's something that really can't be quantified, and that's the game feel. Despite Sage being a universally understood must pick, in the ranked context, it didn't feel to me like the community was in an uproar about this. Perhaps if you felt you had to pick Sage when no one else would, but other than that, she felt, to me anyway, to be perceived as a quintessential Valorant agent in terms of gameplay. Put win rates aside, she just felt good to engage with for everyone involved, which I think is an important question to ask. Even if she was the single most overpowered ranked character, does that matter if it makes the gameplay better? Because I'm willing to bet another character is going to creep up out of the woodwork. I don't know if the devs are ever going to get away from one or two agents standing out amongst the rest, statistically speaking. And something to consider that's really going to drive a wedge between the two areas of play is the concept of how players evolving the game changes the meta aside from balance. And I think that has a bigger effect in Valorant than in other games because of how tactic and map dependent a lot of the strategies are. So as players learn lineups, wall banks, timings, map spots, the threat of damage in the game simply goes up. And a problem is that Sage at higher tiers maybe doesn't keep up with some of the high level depth that you can get out of her, because yeah, maybe you can do some pretty cool cross map slow orb lineups that can help your team as they rush in. There's lots of other options for tossing stuff across the map right now. So really, the biggest strength Sage had in higher level team play is the set execute plays with her wall, like getting plants down on Haven B or bind A short. But that's exactly what they're taking away from her. So because of that, her highest level plays are getting stunted, and with that goes kind of her skill ceiling, all because her base output was too reliable, which I think is kind of a shame. The most interesting part of her kit to me was how she could wall off aggressively. But now for the sake of ranked balance, Riot says this tempo setting support role play isn't a playstyle they want Sage to have. I mean, the character has a voice line saying, "I'm not just your healer," but the balance of her is implying that that's not necessarily true. Though to be fair, I definitely can understand Riot wanting to get ahead of adverse meta trends before they sneak up on you. Something Riot needs to consider is the compounding effect of having more and more agents of a similar type. We haven't seen a triple Sentinel meta take shape yet, though I'll say it was a comp that Cloud9 used as a counter strat to the Sentinels on their best map split, and was the only map Sentinels lost in the Pop Flash tournament. The game plan was to really slow down the aggressive tendencies of the Sentinels, who typically can just roll over teams. And although I thought it was an interesting counter strat, we definitely don't want to see it becoming a mainstream meta, so erring on the side of caution might be the right call. After all, Overwatch had an entire meta where no damage heroes were viable, and it was terrible. Riot doesn't want Valorant to ever find itself in a similar place, so you can understand them wanting to get ahead of it. In the same vein, they know what agents are coming down the road. Maybe these decisions make more sense when we eventually get another healer, and perhaps due to how well Sage fits into the solo queue meta, she still performs averagely anyway, just due to how well she fits in it, and perhaps she won't be good enough for organized play, but maybe that's a world we'll just have to live with. I want to stress that I don't believe I've ever seen a game where there wasn't lopsided results of some parts of it over others. Reason being, the thing that is just like 1% better when an entire community either believes a certain thing or has a certain way of playing the game, you can get these lopsided results. But what I would like Riot to try to do is, instead of focusing on attempting to get agents in line with desired performance metrics, keep a clearer focus on what type of gameplay they're trying to promote. Because thankfully, the balance never feels too oppressive to me in Valorant because of how diverse the game is and how much you can get done by yourself. It's still very much a team-based game, but it's not as egregious as like not having a tank or a healer in Overwatch. So even when you were at the disadvantage to not have a Sage, it didn't feel as bad to me. And when you have metas that are performing quite well, I like to try to hold on to them because you never know what's going to be on the other side. The grass isn't always greener. But that's all my thoughts on this subject. Let me know yours in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave it a like. It really does help us out and lets us know that you're enjoying the content. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and be sure to hit the bell icon so that you actually get notified when our videos go live. Link in the description is our Twitter. Hit us a follow on there. We'd love to discuss the game of Valorant with you. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for Clickheads. We'll see you guys next time.